everyone, let's talk about the phases of the moon. So the moon is the closest object between Earth and the sun. And it's about 384,400 kilometers. Or you could say 240,000 miles, which is really, really far. It doesn't look like it from this model, but this model is also not to scale. Translation, the moon is incredibly far away from Earth. And yet, even though it's 240,000 miles away, it is still our closest object between us and the sun. If you look into the sky at any given evening, you will notice that the moon appears to change shape. Well, this is because the moon orbits the Earth while the Earth orbits the sun. The position of where the moon is at relative to the sun and Earth determines what phase of the moon that we're going to have. So with that said, let me draw it out for you for understanding. Okay, so let me draw out the different phases of the moon. Phases of the moon. We have 5 phases, which means we have 5 different shapes. The first shape that we're going to talk about, and everybody probably recognizes, is a full moon. Now, I know that's not a perfect circle, and that's okay. I'm going to color it in with yellow to represent sunlight. If I had black paper, I could use a white colored pencil, but this is a little easier. So when we can see all of the moon, we call that a full moon. It's when we can see all of it. The next phase that we have is called a gibbous moon. And that means that we can see most of it. So let me color it in. When we can see most of the moon, not all of it would be a full moon. But if we can see most of the moon, we call that a gibbous moon, mostly lit. Not lit like the way you teenagers use the word lit, but lit like illuminated. When we can see most of the moon, we call that a gibbous moon. The next phase let me color in my shaded side, is when we can see half of the moon. This is called a quarter moon. And I'm sure you guys are going, why is it called a quarter moon when we can see half of it? And I'll explain why in just a minute. So when we can see half of the moon, half moon is lit, we call that a quarter moon. The next phase let me color this in. Is when we can only see a little bit of the moon. And we call that a crescent moon. And that is when we can barely see it, or when it is barely lit. Lit as in illuminated, we can barely see it. We call that a crescent moon. And then the last one is when you can't see it at all. And when we can't see the moon at all, we call that a new moon. Not like the Twilight series, new moon, not like that at all. New moon, when we can't see it. It's a dark moon. We can't see it. Now, in between all of this, there are 2 additional terminology that we need to know. We have something called waxing, a waxing moon. And that means that the moon is getting bigger. And we have waning. And that means that the moon is getting smaller. So in order to understand these two terms, along with these 5 phases, we need to look at the moon relative to the Earth and Sun in our straight down model. Okay, let's go ahead and continue with our explanation of the phases. So I have them here and I drew them smaller. So we have full moon, where we can see all of it. Gibbous moon, where it's mostly lit. Lit as in illuminated, not lit as in the way you teenagers use it. But gibbous, where we can see most of it. Quarter moon, which is where we can see half of the moon, and I'll explain why they call it a quarter moon later. We have the crescent moon, where we can see just a little bit of it, or it's barely lit. Again, lit as in illuminated. And the new moon, where it is a dark moon. Okay, so let me explain these phases in our straight down model. So if we are looking straight down, we would have our Earth here, and I'm going to draw sunlight coming in this direction. Well, I suppose I should add some yellow so that we are consistent here. That is our sunlight. Now, I am going to draw this in perspective. So this is the dark half. This half of Earth does not get light, and this half of our Earth does. Let's look at how these phases are from Earth's perspective relative to sunlight. Let's start with the moon here. And we're going to stay consistent with which side is shaded. This side is going to be shaded because sunlight is coming from this direction. Okay. So from Earth's perspective, looking at it in this direction, we can't see anything. So that is new moon, because we can't, it's a dark moon, we can't see anything. The next moon that we have here, and we're going to be consistent, draw the opposite side shaded. Light is coming from this direction. We can see half of the moon, so this is our quarter moon. So I'm going to write half moon here, because from our perspective, that's what we can see. Okay. The next moon that I'm going to draw, let me draw this side shaded here, like that. And we're staying consistent. Sunlight is coming from this direction. So from Earth's perspective, looking out, we can see all of it. So this is actually full moon. Okay? And then the other moon, looking here, we're going to stay consistent. This half is going to be dark. Okay? So from Earth's perspective, looking this way, we can see half of the moon. So again, you have a quarter moon or half moon. So in this diagram, I have drawn full moon, new moon, and the quarter moon. Well, what about the other two? Okay, so I'm going to draw moon here. We're going to stay consistent as far as the shading goes. If we are going to be from Earth's perspective, looking out, we would be able to see a sliver of it. We would only be able to see a little bit of that, and that would be our crescent moon. Okay, if I put another moon here, let's stay consistent. This half of the moon is dark. This half of the moon is light. If we were to look at it from Earth's perspective, we would be able to see, mind you, this part right here is shaded. We would be able to see most of it. This would be a gibbous moon. Okay, then we have another moon here. If we make this dark so that we stay consistent, and this half is light, from Earth's perspective, looking out this way, we would be able to see most of it. And because we can see most of it, that is also a gibbous moon. And then in between these two, we have another moon. We're going to stay consistent. This half is dark. This half is light. From Earth's perspective looking out, we would be able to see a little bit of it. And again, we would have a crescent moon. Now, when we look at this diagram, we see that this half of all of our moons, this half is lighted, and this half of all of our moons are dark. That is consistent with the direction that sunlight is hitting. Now, I'm going to draw it this way from these perspectives so that it makes sense. So now, from Earth's perspective, looking out, what we would see in the sky is a completely dark moon. So again, that is our new moon. We can't see it. It is dark. Looking out from Earth's perspective in the sky, if we were going to look up, this is what we would see. Mostly dark moon with just a sliver. Now, on the previous picture, we had two different terminologies or two different vocabulary terms that we needed to add in. We had the term waxing, which means our moon is getting bigger. And we had the term waning, which means our moon is getting smaller. So we're going to use these two vocabulary terms within our moons. Okay, so if we go from dark moon, where we cannot see it, to where we can see a little bit of our moon from Earth's perspective, so from here to here, the moon is getting bigger, and therefore we have waxing crescent. The moon is getting bigger. And I also want to point out that the left side of the moon is dark here. So we're getting from nothing to something, the left side of the moon is dark. So let's transition from here. This side doesn't really change at all. You still have your dark half, you still have your lighted half, but the left half of the moon is dark and we can't see it. So back to your quarter, from here to here, the moon is getting bigger, but we call this first quarter because it was the quarter moon out of our 4 original moons, okay? We're still getting bigger, first quarter. The left side of the moon is dark. Now from this perspective, when we look into the sky, this is what we see. We see most of the moon, but there is still some dark part right here. There's a little bit that's shaded, but we can see most of the moon. The left side of the moon is dark here, but we are still getting bigger. So we would have waxing gibbous. The moon is still getting bigger. So we have waxing gibbous. And the left side of the moon is dark. So now from Earth's perspective, if we turn here, we look into the sky and we see all of the moon. Well, there's no change there. That is still full moon. Now from Earth's perspective, we look into the sky here. Let me add our illuminated end. Now the moon is changing. The direction in which the side is shaded is changing. So from here to here, the moon is still getting bigger. Now from full moon to here, the moon is getting smaller because now we're getting this shaded section. So smaller. And this This here is called waning gibbous. We can see most of the moon, but now it is getting smaller. And I also want to point out that the right side of the moon is becoming shaded. Okay, so now from Earth's perspective, if we look here, there is no change. We still have the same shaded side, and we still have the same illuminated side because the sunlight is still coming from the same direction. But remember, we originally said this was a quarter moon. So from here to here, we're gaining more shade. The shaded side is getting bigger, so we're not able to see as much. So the moon is still getting smaller. And this was a quarter moon. We call this third quarter. Moon is getting smaller. And then for our last one, from this perspective out, when we look into the sky, what we would see when we look up is something like this. The left side of the moon would be illuminated, and the right side of the moon is dark. So from here to here, we are still getting smaller, and we would call this Waning Crescent. And then from here to here, the moon is getting smaller, and we can't see it to new moon. And I want to point out in the whole drawing that I've created, in this one, the shaded side is consistent, the lighted side is consistent. And if you look at the bigger picture, the shaded side matches the inner drawing, and the lighted side matches the inner drawing. So from Earth's perspective, you have new moon where we can't see it. The moon is getting bigger slightly to where we can see a little bit of it. Waxing crescent. Then the moon will continue to grow from waxing crescent. It will get bigger and bigger and bigger till we can see half of the moon, first quarter. Now from first quarter, the moon is going to continue to get bigger. Bigger. The moon is going to continue to get bigger. A little bit more. We can see more of it, more of it, more of it. We've got waxing gibbous. We can see most of the moon, but there is still some shade. Waxing gibbous, and then the moon is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until, hey, we can see all of it, thus our full moon. After our full moon, now the moon is starting to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and now look, the shaded side is starting to come in. It's the right side, so therefore we have waning gibbous because it is getting smaller. Now from Earth's perspective, the moon is getting smaller and smaller till now I can only see half of it, but the right side is the shaded side. That's why it's third quarter. And then it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller till we get to waning crescent, where it's barely lit, but the right side is the shaded side until we get back to our new moon. Waxing, moon is getting bigger. The left side of the moon is dark. Waning, the moon is getting smaller. The right side of the moon is dark. And that is the different phases of the moon based on Earth's perspective from the moon's location relative to the sunlight.